Many authors have plied their talents to the concept of effecting change through the sheer magnified power of one's own will, and I myself have here on YouTube defined magic as the second half of the God equation. Essentially, people worship that which rules their lives and venerate that which empowers them. I.e., we worship the gods because we covet their power, and so we develop systems of communion which various peoples have called magic, miracles, and now most recently, science. What does this have to do with the title's subject? Well, you see, a while ago, and by a while I mean around 14 years or so, I was thinking about the Force in Star Wars and how it's supposed to have a will, which the elect few who are sensitive can intuit and to some degree manipulate via the midichlorians. Around the same time, I was just learning about quantum mechanics, namely the concept of a superposition, and how the act of observing a particle's waveform causes said form to collapse into a single quantizable position. And from here, it occurred to me to wonder at exactly what point would the emanations from a conscious mind be translated into magical effects. In other words, how exactly does the act of thinking about setting something 50 yards away on fire get translated into actually hurling a bolt of effulgent plasma at it? The solution I eventually, and by eventually, I mean over the course of the next 5 to 6 years or so, came up with was a metaphysical addendum to the real standard model of quantum physics, specifically quantum field theory, which, for those who are unfamiliar, is the modern scientific iteration of the ancient Hermetic principles of vibration and rhythm. In my view, the fundamental force and substance of magic would be no more or less than a parallax plane to our own normal dimensions of tangible substance. But rather than me try to stretch some low-poly words over this concept's infinitely complex geometry, let me instead just show you what I'm on about. Here we see an artist's rendition of the elementary particles we're all familiar with, protons, neutrons, electrons, etc., emanating from the baseline cosmic fabric known as the quantum foam or the quantum vacuum. And yes, before anyone gets ahead of me in the comments, this is describing the same, or at least covering similar ground as the primordial substance our ancient ancestors would have known as Jinungagap, the Tao, Chaos, or the Prima Materia. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention here that in more recent years, this same plane of eldritch fancy has been called the outer darkness, the warp, the force, and the outside, among others. And now, with our baseline established, let me draw for you a picture of how I would merge these two realms on a quantizable scientific level. As before with the quantum vacuum, here we have my own visualized render of the abraxonic void congealing into atomic flakes of extra-physical matter known as orons, the interplay between which I've hitherto coined as the gravitance field, and its field of study I've called gravitance field dynamics, or GFD. For the fundaments of GFD, I shall defer you to an abridged excerpt from my own book outlining my outlook on both the practical philosophy and fictional praxeology of the arcane, along with some illustrative technical examples from the same. To quote, "Many who read this text will doubtlessly be familiar with the concepts of primeval order and chaos. If not, you need only acquaint yourself with any major world religion or mythology to learn the basic gist. Any student of arcane lore will also have encountered the ideas of the divine masculine and feminine, represented in the European alchemical tradition as sulfur and mercury, respectively, together forming the requisite hammer and anvil for the construction of the lapis, or philosopher's stone, from which would be distilled the elixir of life, or in the Eastern tradition of the yin-yang. In both cases, the one representing the bright, hot, passionate drive of the male to obtain power and thus impose order through the force of his divine mind and will. The other, the cold, serene, calculating, mischievous mind of the chaotic heart and soul, wanting to live and to bask in the eternal present, unbothered by the ends of either the past or future. There is power in each, power meaning simply the ability to do. But there is danger also. What does any of this have to do with casting spells? Well, the first particle in the standard model of sorcery is the oron, or the god particle. To know its power, we must first understand what is meant by information, mechanically speaking. Recall the previous section's layout of time, space, energy, and matter, and know that the discrete sum of all four equals the quantum apparent, which we will go forth calling by its more conventional name, now. Now know that by information, in this text, is meant the difference between any one quanta of now and the next. Ergo, information possessed by any particular object or body is called knowledge. In essence, Just as how a reflective pattern of the information embedded in the arrangement of this text is stored in the neurons of your brain, so does a spring know how and when to deform when subjected to a compressive force from the crystalline pattern of its interatomic construction. As well as how your brain retains the knowledge it just absorbed a few seconds ago, likewise the spring retains the knowledge of its original, stressless state, and so can return to it once said deforming stress energy is removed. In both cases, this process of obtaining and retaining knowledge is called memory. It is for this same reason why, if you and a dog eat out of the same food dish, you will not magically transform into a dog, nor vice versa. Quite simply, orons are the structural component of the magical weave. They are the sulfuric yin of its duopolistic equation. They transmit the structural pattern of order as instructed by the will of the practitioner onto the ritual being performed, without ever being transformed themselves in the process. Needless to say, the concentration and force of willpower necessary to force-feed meaning directly into the very marrow of the world far exceeds the limits of any normal mortal. This is why sorcery is a craft, not an exact science. Which brings us nicely to the second fundamental element in this compound model of esoterica, the abraxon, or chaos particle. This one hardly needs any explanation. To feed one's will to chaos is to, in a sense, part ways with it, to surrender control and let fate take its course. But to do so intelligently is a skill only a select few can possess, let alone master, and know that to act purposefully, not compulsively, and in the full, absolute, undiluted knowledge of one's true meaning and intent is what being a sorcerer truly means." End quote. Now, somehow, on the tides of all that esoteric brainwashing and philosophizing, I forgot to mention the most critical component of all from a fictional standpoint, the OMI, or Oronic Mass Index, defining the concentration of etheric particles in one system. The greater the concentration of magical mass, the greater your magnitude of control over the etheric winds. Essentially my version of your midichlorian count. For instance, one of the main characters in my FPA books, one of the most naturally powerful sorceresses of her era, has an OMI in excess of 400,000 parts per million. Hopefully that was all fairly clear and not horribly obtuse as these sorts of hypothetical wanderings tend to be, at least with me at the helm. Let me know your thoughts, or if you have any questions, leave them down in the comments. I'll do my best to answer them all. And as usual, if you like this and want to see this magic system in practice, consider checking out my books on Amazon. Or if you want to support me but are lacking the time to invest in a full-fledged novel reading, then consider tossing a coin into my hat with the super thanks or super chat features. And until next time, stay safe, stay sane, and in the words of a great and ever so slightly senile old wizard, the best thing for being sad is to learn something. Learning is the only thing the mind can never exhaust, never alienate, never be tortured by, never fear or distrust, and never dream of regretting. Like I said, slightly senile, but I find the sentiment agreeable, if not wholly practical nonetheless. Peace.